In just 7 minutes, a 44-year-old black congresswoman dismantled 3 decades of privilege, with nothing but facts, composure, and a single sentence that made a Trump apologize on live TV. But this wasn't a viral takedown, a trending clip for clicks, or a moment of anger unleashed. Number. This was something else entirely. This was a masterclass in quiet power. In a room chilled by overactive air conditioning and centuries of unspoken hierarchy, she didn't shout, she didn't flinch, and she didn't try to impress. She simply laid out the truth, layer by layer, document by document, until even those who came to ignore her had no choice but to listen. And when she finally said, "Your privilege is not experience. Your confidence is not competence," the room fell silent. The internet exploded. And for millions of Americans, especially women who had spent a lifetime being talked over, it felt like justice had finally raised its voice. But what really happened in that cold Capitol hearing room? Who is Jasmine Crockett, and how did her steady hands unravel a golden empire built on assumption? To understand the weight of that moment, we need to go back to the stillness before the storm, to the very first second she stepped into that room. The room was cold, not just in temperature, but in legacy. The Canon Committee Chamber, with its high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and sterile fluorescent lights, had witnessed decades of political theater. But today, something felt different. The air was over-conditioned, laced with that strange government blend of furniture polish, old paper, and brewing tension. It was the kind of chill that crept under your skin, not because of the thermostat, but because of what you knew was about to unfold. Outside, a gray October sky hung low, threatening rain but refusing to break. Inside, the setup was textbook Washington. The American flag draped solemnly to the right, press cameras nestled like vultures in the rear gallery, and rows of aides with notepads ready. Not for truth, but for spin. It was theater. Until she walked in. Jasmine Crockett didn't command attention with noise. She did it with silence. The kind of silence that makes people look up without knowing why. She moved with precision, her tailored navy blazer perfectly framing a gold brooch shaped like the U.S. Constitution. A document she knew not just in letter, but in lived experience. Her nails, a professional shade of deep red, tapped softly on a stack of color-coded documents. Her pearl earrings caught the light as she scanned the room. Not nervously, but intentionally, noticing everything, filing it away. There was an untouched glass of water to her right and an open leather portfolio to her left, neatly organized with tabs in red, blue, and yellow. But what truly stood out was her stillness. In a room full of people fidgeting, whispering, adjusting microphones, she was the only one not moving. Not because she was frozen, but because she was focused, like someone who knew the moment was coming and had been waiting for it. Then came the sound. Expensive leather soles, a rhythmic, confident stride. Barron Trump entered, tall, impeccably dressed in a light blue suit that looked too pristine for politics. His jaw was set, his watch glinted under the lights, and his entourage followed close behind, like satellites circling a star. He leaned over the witness table, his frame almost consuming the microphone. His tablet gleamed gold. His smile was tight, calculated. He looked around as if the room already belonged to him. But if you looked closely, closer than the cameras ever would, you'd notice something. Jasmine's gaze didn't flinch. Her hands didn't twitch. Her breath didn't catch. She watched him the way a chess master watches a confident beginner. Not with disdain, but with patience. Because she had read his file, his statements, his charity reports. All 147 pages of them. And tucked between those documents in her leather folder were quiet landmines. Questions crafted not to provoke, but to expose. The room didn't know it yet, but history was already shifting under the oak floorboards. And somewhere, beneath the chill of politics and posture, a storm had already begun to gather, silent, unshakable, and waiting for the first strike. Long before the marble floors of Congress echoed under her heels, Jasmine Crockett had stood in courtrooms where her presence was a disruption. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't look like the lawyers who usually stood at the defense table. And worse, She didn't act like she was supposed to either. In Bowie County, Texas, judges called her honey and young lady with the condescension of tradition wrapped in politeness. Prosecutors smirked as they tried to explain laws she had already mastered. And jurors, conditioned by a lifetime of subtle biases, raised their eyebrows the moment she walked in with a black client and a legal brief clutched in the same hand. She didn't argue louder. She argued better. There was one case, early in her second year as a public defender, that still echoed inside her. A man, falsely accused, black, jobless, terrified, looked at her like she was the only thing standing between him and a system that had never shown him mercy. During her closing argument, the judge interrupted her mid-sentence to ask if this was her first big trial. Her lips didn't tremble. She simply smiled, turned to the jury, and cited 3 prior cases she had already won, cases that had become local precedent. The courtroom went silent. The judge didn't apologize. He didn't need to. She had already won, and everyone in the room knew it. Years passed, and case by case, prejudice became fuel. She didn't carry anger into the courtroom. She carried strategy. She began to master the art of controlled dismantling, of building facts like walls around her arguments, brick by brick, until no one could punch through them without looking like a fool. She became known, not loudly but consistently. The public defenders whispered her name with respect. Prosecutors began preparing harder when they saw her listed. And slowly her work shifted from defense to advocacy, from protecting the wrongly accused to taking on the structures that wrongly accused them. She began fighting for civil rights, policing reforms, voting protections, education equity. She wrote, she organized, she argued in front of city councils and on national panels. She stopped being a local problem and started being a national voice. But even as her name gained weight, her tools remained the same: research, preparation, control. Her victories weren't viral, they were methodical, and they always came from the same place: not privilege, but pressure; not family name, but frontline fire. So when she sat there in that freezing Capitol chamber, her spine straight, her files immaculate, and her voice still untouched by nerves, it wasn't because she had nothing to fear. It was because she had already survived rooms far colder, far crueler, and far less fair. And the weight of those rooms, that accumulated resistance pressed into years of experience, was now armor, silent, invisible, unbreakable. Barron Trump sat tall at the witness table, a human monument to legacy. At 19, he carried himself with the poised confidence of someone who had never been told no without an explanation and never been asked for credentials without receiving applause. His suit, custom-fitted ocean blue, hung on his frame with the ease of someone whose measurements had been taken by tailors since childhood. Every detail was deliberate: the perfect part in his hair, the golden cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights, the American flag pin, a whisper of patriotism wrapped in designer steel. Even his tablet shimmered, gold-trimmed and fingerprint-free, like it had been polished for a photo op instead of used for research. His watch, the size of a small compass, ticked with the quiet precision of inherited luxury. But the real power wasn't in what he wore. It was in how he believed he belonged. To him, this hearing wasn't a test, it was a formality, another televised moment in a life already curated for impact. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to own the space, not enough to seem aggressive. He smiled, not warmly but strategically, like someone who had practiced expressions in mirrors built into penthouse walls. He scanned the room and saw what he expected: deference, curiosity, perhaps a few skeptics he'd convert with charm. But challenge? That wasn't part of the script. Because Barron had grown up in a world where confidence was currency, and where confidence was almost always mistaken for competence. He had been raised in rooms where people spoke in absolutes, where nuance was weakness, and where uncertainty could cost you a brand deal. He learned early that declarations, loud, certain, and #ready, mattered more than messy truths. When he launched his education charity, it wasn't built from classroom visits or policy research. It was built from a press release, a glossy brochure, and a software company eager to pivot toward a philanthropic arm. But none of that felt dishonest to him. After all, he'd seen it work, again and again, in boardrooms, on stages, in debates. The story didn't have to be true. It just had to be clean, confident, and repeated with conviction. He had been told his perspective was fresh, his ideas disruptive, his name an asset. And why wouldn't he believe it? Every room he entered bowed before it. Every microphone that faced him was already half convinced. Even here, in this hearing room, the chairman had introduced him with glowing praise, omitting credentials but emphasizing innovation. It reinforced what he had always known. Posture beats preparation, presence beats perspective. And sometimes a well-cut suit says more than a resume ever could. But what Barron didn't know, what no one had prepared him for, was what happens when all of that meets a woman like Jasmine Crockett. A woman who wasn't interested in his name, his tone, or the tight script he brought with him. A woman who didn't come to be impressed, but to ask the kind of questions that don't care how tall you are, the kind that don't back down when answers fall apart. And as the cameras panned across the chamber and the gavel finally struck wood, Barron Trump still believed he was ready. He wasn't. The gavel struck 3 times, sharp, ceremonial, almost theatrical. The chairman, a silver-haired Republican from Ohio, offered a brief opening filled with the expected pleasantries, then turned toward the young man at the center of the room, with a smile that felt more like a passing of the baton than a mere introduction. "Mr. Trump," he said with a paternal nod, "we're eager to hear from someone representing the next generation of leadership and educational innovation." No mention of credentials, no mention of experience, just the weight of a surname and the shimmer of expectation. Barron Trump leaned into the mic, his voice polished, practiced, and dipped in just enough humility to sound palatable. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began. "I deeply appreciate the opportunity to speak on a topic I care about deeply. As someone who understands technology better than most people of your generation." He turned briefly to the left, glancing toward Crockett without using her title. "I believe we have a responsibility to introduce smart, scalable solutions that meet students where they are, not where outdated systems think they should be." The room shifted slightly, a few eyebrows raised. The press leaned in just a little closer. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained folded neatly atop her portfolio. But in her stillness, there was movement, like a tide pulling back before a wave. Barron continued. "We've donated thousands of tablets to urban school districts across the country. These devices aren't just screens, they're windows into the future. Children today need access to digital tools to be competitive. That's the real equity issue. We can't keep clinging to chalkboards and old textbooks and expect results." He smiled then, a bit too satisfied, as if waiting for polite applause, or at least a ripple of agreement. It didn't come. Instead, Congresswoman Crockett shifted gently in her chair and tapped her finger once on the folder in front of her before speaking. Her voice was calm, measured, unhurried, but unmistakably precise. "Mr. Trump," she said, "I'm not questioning the value of technology. I'm questioning the assumption that putting devices into children's hands without also addressing the lack of infrastructure, teacher support, and internet access is somehow a complete solution." There was no defensiveness in her tone, only clarity, and that was what made it land so heavily. Barron opened his mouth slightly, surprised that she had spoken so early, even more surprised that her tone hadn't risen in challenge. But she wasn't interested in sparring. She was interested in substance. And while he had come to deliver a show, she had come to deliver a reckoning. "1 in 3 students in my district," she continued, "doesn't have stable internet at home. A tablet without a connection is just an expensive paperweight. So I ask again, what's the plan for those children?" A pause settled into the room. Not silence, something denser, the kind of quiet that follows a truth spoken plainly. It was no longer just a hearing. It had become a confrontation of worldviews. And this was only the opening salvo. Congresswoman Crockett flipped to a tab marked in red and lifted a sheet from her folder, the paper whispering slightly as it moved. "According to the Department of Education," she said evenly, her eyes still fixed on the young man across the table. 41% of families in my district lack access to high-speed internet at home. Among low-income Black and Latino households, that number rises to nearly 58%. Her tone was neither confrontational nor emotional. It was surgical, designed to cut through posturing and lay bare the facts. She placed the page gently on the table and continued, "And while your organization's promotional material describes tablets as a comprehensive educational solution, your own internal data, buried on page 112 of your annual impact report, shows that students without reliable internet are 68% less likely to complete assignments delivered through these devices. That's not equity. That's exclusion, dressed up as innovation." The press gallery stirred, cameras adjusting, fingers pausing mid-typing. Something was shifting, not just in the narrative, but in the room's energy. Crockett hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The data spoke for her. Barron Trump leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly not expecting this level of specificity so early in the hearing. He offered a brief, dismissive chuckle, the kind reserved for cocktail parties and conference panels. "Congresswoman," he said, still avoiding her title, "everyone has a cell phone these days. Students can just use their phones as hotspots. That's what I did in college when the Wi-Fi went down." He smiled again, more to the cameras than to the committee. He believed he had offered a practical, even relatable solution. But the expression on Crockett's face remained unchanged, not frozen, not offended, just still. She allowed the silence to grow, widening the space between his remark and her response until the weight of his words began to press in on the room like humidity before a storm. When she finally spoke, it was softer than before. "Mr. Trump," she said, "in parts of my district, families choose between paying for electricity or paying for their phone bill. Unlimited data isn't a convenience, it's a luxury. And asking a 13-year-old to write an essay on a tablet connected through their mom's prepaid phone plan while their siblings share the same bedroom table isn't innovation. It's negligence disguised as empathy." The room fell quiet again, not because of drama, but because there was no rebuttal that didn't sound like an excuse. Barron's smile faltered for a split second, just long enough to be noticed by those who were watching closely. The facts weren't just inconvenient, they were unfamiliar. He had walked into this hearing with confidence. But confidence, when untethered from understanding, becomes fragile fast. And now that fragility was beginning to show. In the pause that followed her words, Jasmine Crockett didn't look at Barron Trump. She didn't need to. The silence already said what his expressions couldn't hide. Instead, she let her eyes drift, just for a moment, toward the gallery where a handful of educators from her district sat quietly among the crowd. The cameras wouldn't catch what she saw. Most wouldn't even notice. But for Crockett, it was everything. There, seated 2 rows back, wearing a deep burgundy coat and a necklace made of wooden beads, was Ms. Elenina Washington, 68 years old, principal of Westmore Elementary for over 4 decades. A woman who had kept her school standing, literally through budget cuts, flooding, broken heating, and bureaucratic neglect. She had taught 3rd grade before moving into leadership, guided 3 generations of families, and mentored teachers who had never read a single line about her in the news. She didn't tweet, she didn't trend. But if anyone knew what it meant to educate in the margins, it was her. And in that still moment, as the room lingered in silence, Ms. Washington met Jasmine Crockett's gaze and gave the slightest nod. Not a dramatic gesture, not a slow clap, just a single deliberate movement, a barely perceptible lowering and raising of her chin. But within it was a transmission of something electric and ancient. Recognition, respect. A quiet salute from one woman who had survived 1,000 dismissals to another who had just dismantled one in real time. No words were spoken, but the message was unmistakable. "I see you. I've lived this. And today you're speaking for all of us." Crockett felt it settle inside her like heat rising from coals long buried under ash. That nod didn't fuel her anger. It anchored her resolve. It reminded her why she was here. Not to win an argument, not to go viral, but for women like Miss Washington who had spent decades in underfunded classrooms, listening to men with polished shoes and empty hands explain what education meant. For the black mothers who had to bring bottled water to schools where the pipes had failed, for the teachers who worked 2 jobs and still bought their students supplies, for the ones who never got a microphone, let alone a hearing room. She straightened her spine just slightly, not for show but from something deeper, a gathering of presence, a grounding. She didn't smile. She didn't nod back. She simply turned her gaze back to the table in front of her, gently flipped to a new tab in her folder, and reached for the next document. Barron Trump didn't notice the nod. He didn't see the moment pass like lightning between 2 generations of fighters. But the room had shifted again, subtly, quietly, like the tremor before the earthquake. And Jasmine Crockett, now burning from within, was just getting started. Jasmine Crockett had learned long ago that silence could be louder than outrage. In courtrooms where every glance was judged and every word could be twisted, she had discovered that timing was as critical as the truth itself. And now, seated beneath the artificial lights of congressional power, she felt that familiar current running beneath her skin, not nerves but strategy sharpening. She didn't come for sound bites. She came with a map. "Mr. Trump," she began, sliding a document toward him like a chess piece moved with intention. "You've spoken of progress monitoring software built into your tablets. According to your organization's report, specifically Appendix C, students without home internet access were 68% less likely to complete assignments. Does your program address this disparity in connectivity?" The tone was polite, even-handed, but behind it lay an undercurrent, calculated restraint. She didn't accuse. She asked, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the question itself was a trap disguised as curiosity. Barron glanced at the document but didn't touch it. "As I've said," he replied, adjusting his microphone slightly, "students can use their phones as hotspots. It's a common workaround." A slight pause. Crockett nodded slowly, letting the room breathe in the absurdity of that response. Then she spoke again, measured, soft, but landing like a quiet gavel. "In my district, Mr. Trump, more than 40% of families are on limited data plans. Many choose between groceries and gigabytes. Your workaround assumes a luxury many of these children simply don't have." Barron shifted in his seat. A ripple passed through the room. Crockett sensed it. She let it sit, and then she reached for the next move. "Also," she continued, flipping to another color-coded tab, "your executive summary claims that your program improves performance. Yet an independent study conducted by the University of Texas found that reading scores in districts using your tablets dropped 3.2% over the following school year. Would you care to explain that?" This time, she didn't look at him. She looked at the data, held it in her hands like a compass. Her voice didn't rise, but her presence did. Barron blinked, then laughed awkwardly. "That study has been widely criticized. Our internal research shows a very different picture." Crockett raised her eyes, calm as a still lake. "Then I'd ask that you submit your internal findings for committee review. I'm sure we'd all be interested in comparing methodologies." He hesitated, just for a second, but Crockett caught it, the micro delay, the brief flicker of discomfort, and she knew what it meant. The power dynamic was shifting, not because she had seized it, but because he had started letting it go, inch by inch, without realizing. She returned her hands to her folder and prepared the next set of questions. This wasn't about domination, it was about dissection. She was peeling back a narrative layer by layer, knowing that beneath every confident statement, there were numbers, contracts, and contradictions waiting to be revealed. And she was just getting warmed up. The moment wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was definite. A shift too subtle for headlines, but impossible to miss for anyone trained to listen for the seams. Barron Trump leaned forward again, this time a little less certain, his eyes flicking toward the aides behind him before returning to the microphone. "Our data," he said, "shows a 14% increase in digital engagement across all partner schools. That's documented. That's measurable." Crockett didn't interrupt. She waited, gave him rope. Because she knew that data, had read it 3 times, highlighted the margins, annotated the inconsistencies, and she also knew that engagement was a slippery word, one often stretched to cover gaps in actual results. She lifted her folder, flipped to a section marked in yellow, and removed a single page. Mr. Trump, she began, tone unchanging. The report you're referencing cites a 14% increase in login frequency. Not assignment completion, not reading comprehension, not grade improvement, just logins. And even that figure is based on a 3-week pilot involving only 5 schools, all of which received additional support staff during the evaluation period. A few heads turned in the gallery. The press gallery scribbled faster. Barron blinked. That context wasn't included in the summary provided to me, he replied, visibly thrown. But look, the key point is, these are real metrics, not ideological talking points. Crockett didn't take the bait. Instead, she gently slid another document across the table. This one marked with 3 tabs, each color-coded and dog-eared. Let's talk about metrics then, she said, her voice still calm, still razor-sharp. According to public records, your organization received over $13 million in government contracts last fiscal year. Contracts, I might add, awarded without competitive bidding, under an emergency funding provision for educational relief. A murmur ran through the gallery. Crockett's gaze remained steady. Now that's not illegal, she continued, but it does raise questions, especially when your public statements emphasize private sector independence. Would you like to clarify the discrepancy between your messaging and your funding? Barron reached for his water but didn't drink. His posture had shifted, still tall, still polished, but no longer anchored. Those contracts represent only a fraction of our budget, he said quickly, and they were awarded on merit. Crockett gave a subtle nod. A small fraction of $18 million in total revenue is still over 70% of your operating funds, Mr. Trump. Words like fraction can be misleading when context is stripped away. There was no aggression in her voice, only math. Across the room, attention began to consolidate. A Democratic representative from Michigan leaned in. A Republican from Texas stopped checking his phone. What had begun as another staged committee exchange was evolving into something else, an unmasking. And as Barron Trump shifted in his seat, searching for a footing that no longer existed, the room began to realize something he had not. The mask was cracking, and Jasmine Crockett was holding the light. The air inside the committee room had shifted, not with noise but with density, like the weight of attention had finally settled on the center of gravity. Jasmine Crockett flipped one final tab, her fingers deliberate, her breath steady. And when she looked up, her voice didn't change in volume or tone, but its aim was unmistakable. Mr. Trump, she asked, before launching your tablet initiative, before marketing it as a transformative tool for low-income public schools, how many hours did you personally spend inside one? I mean physically in a classroom, not on a video call, not at a photo op, but inside listening to teachers, watching students, seeing the conditions firsthand. The room didn't move. Even the cameras seemed to freeze, as if bracing for something. Barron Trump blinked once, then smiled faintly, like someone who had just been handed a puzzle he hadn't prepared for. My team conducted extensive research, he said. We compiled studies from education consultants and conducted interviews with superintendents across multiple states. Crockett didn't nod. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched him and waited. Not impatiently, not accusingly, just patiently. After a few seconds of uncomfortable quiet, she spoke again, this time even softer. So to clarify for the record, before designing a solution for millions of public school students, you personally spent 0 hours in a public classroom? Barron shifted in his seat. I've visited school facilities during speaking events, private schools mostly, and I've reviewed hundreds of hours of footage documenting the challenges in urban education. I don't think physical presence is the only way to understand a problem. Crockett tilted her head just slightly, not in disbelief, in confirmation. Interesting, she said gently, because the teachers I speak to daily might say that no footage can replace the smell of a broken heater in December, the weight of watching a third grader pretend their hunger is just tiredness, or the sting of explaining why their classroom is still waiting for the internet you promised. Across the room, a veteran education journalist, graying, sharp-eyed, and seated near the aisle, broke into the faintest smile. Not smug, not surprised, just familiar. He had seen this moment before, the moment when narrative met fact, when prepared answers stopped working, when someone who had never been questioned was being questioned, not for drama, but for truth. Barron Trump opened his mouth, then closed it again. He reached for his water but didn't sip. For the first time, the words didn't come. Crockett leaned back in her chair, not triumphant, not theatrical, just grounded. She didn't need him to crumble. She only needed the question to hang there long enough for everyone to see it clearly. Because sometimes truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it just needs to be asked, clearly, calmly, and in front of a room that's finally listening. And now they were all listening. Jasmine Crockett hadn't flinched once. Not when Barron Trump dismissed connectivity concerns. Not when he sidestepped the question of first-hand classroom experience. But now, as the stack of documents in front of her thinned to a single folder, labeled in bold red ink, there was a subtle shift in her presence. Her fingers moved more slowly. Her posture sharpened. What came next wasn't a question. It was revelation. "I'd like to enter into the record," she began, "an internal memo obtained via public information request, dated 3 months prior to the launch of the Trump Foundation's educational initiative." She lifted the document, the pages thick, heavy, and annotated with yellow highlights and sticky notes that marked each passage like stepping stones through a minefield. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "This is an email from your product development director," she continued, looking directly at Barron Trump now, "discussing the company's pivot toward the educational sector. I'll read from page 2, second paragraph." She adjusted her glasses, not for effect, but because what came next demanded clarity. Quote, "Confirm the $30 million contract with the Department of Education. Barron suggests we rebrand our enterprise asset management software as specialized educational software to justify the premium price. School districts won't know the difference anyway." There was no gasp at first, only stillness, the kind that precedes storms or headlines, and then slowly the collective inhale. Press, aides, even committee members leaning forward, not for drama, but for confirmation. Yes, they heard that right. Barron Trump blinked hard, his jaw tensed. "That's completely out of context," he said quickly, voice rising in pitch but not volume. "That email is being misinterpreted. It's a casual internal discussion, not an official policy document." Crockett didn't blink. She simply placed the document on the table, open and visible. "It mentions your name directly, suggests a rebranding strategy explicitly tied to government funding, and frames public educators, our schools, as incapable of distinguishing between business software and educational tools." Barron leaned toward the mic, more to reassert control than to clarify. "That wasn't the intention. Our software has multiple applications. It can serve both sectors." "Of course it can," Crockett replied, voice like silk over steel. "But the issue isn't capability, it's intent. Because when a $30 million government-funded program is justified by the assumption that school districts won't know the difference, we're no longer talking about innovation. We're talking about exploitation." Barron opened his mouth to counter, but the words didn't line up. Not this time. He reached for his tablet, scrolled, flipped, looked toward his aides. None met his eye. And across the room, a new sound emerged. The tapping of heels from a press reporter, rising from her seat, notebook in hand, eyes locked on the document that had just detonated a narrative. The bomb had dropped, and Barron Trump was standing in the blast radius. The email still lay open on the table, its yellow highlight practically glowing beneath the fluorescent lights. But Jasmine Crockett didn't pause to admire its impact. She had no interest in spectacle. She was a technician, mid-surgery, and the next incision had to be precise. "Mr. Trump," she said, voice calm and surgical, "you've stated that your software is uniquely designed for public school environments. Let's examine that. According to your public procurement records, the Department of Education paid $597 per license for your platform. Meanwhile, your parent company offers an enterprise version of the same base software to private clients for $189. That's a 216% markup." Barron straightened his back and opened his mouth, but Crockett didn't stop. She flipped to another tab document, lifting it with the grace of a courtroom veteran handing over Exhibit B. This technical report, she said, commissioned by an independent software auditor, compares both versions line by line. The only differences? A blue and green color palette instead of gray and gold, a revised login screen that says, "Welcome students" instead of "Welcome users," and a minor reshuffle of icons. The backend infrastructure is identical. The functionality is identical. The core code, identical. Barron tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand. Not dismissively, but firmly, like a conductor managing tempo. You mentioned earlier that your program reflects Silicon Valley efficiency. In that spirit, let me ask, what exactly justifies charging public schools more than double for what amounts to a superficial rebrand? Barron's voice finally returned, but with a hitch. Educational deployments require support, training, user interface adjustments. We bundled services into the contract to ensure teachers could integrate the platform effectively. Crockett nodded slowly, almost sympathetically. Certainly, support services are necessary. That's why I cross-referenced your budget breakdown. She tapped the next document. Out of the $30 million allocated, only 12% was directed toward on-site training and teacher assistance. Meanwhile, 62% went to administrative overhead, marketing, and executive compensation. Would you say that's consistent with best practices in educational philanthropy? Barron hesitated. Just long enough. We're an innovative model, he said finally, not a traditional nonprofit. We're bringing private sector agility into a broken public system. A few quiet gasps escaped the gallery. Crockett didn't flinch. So innovation, in this case, includes charging taxpayers more than private corporations for the same product and justifying it with design tweaks? Barron shifted. The product works. Crockett folded her hands. That's not the question. The question is whether it works better than equitable staffing, smaller class sizes, or direct investment in school infrastructure, whether it's worth the cost, and whether this committee and the American public have been misled about that value. For a moment, Barron didn't respond. The facts were too dense, the numbers too sharp, the logic too tight. He had walked in expecting applause for his vision, but now he was facing a receipt. The word innovation still hung faintly in the air, like smoke from a match long extinguished. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't chasing flames. She was tracing fuel lines. And where they led wasn't some sleek startup incubator. It was straight into the heart of the public treasury. She opened the next document slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Earlier, Mr. Trump, you described your initiative as primarily funded by private sector contributions, an example of entrepreneurial spirit stepping in where government falls short. She paused, placed a new page on the table, and looked him squarely in the eye. But your organization's own IRS Form 990 tells a different story. Barron sat still, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in preparation. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know how sharp it would be. According to your last fiscal disclosure, Crockett continued, her voice even, government contracts accounted for 78% of your total annual revenue. 78. That's not a supplement. That's a foundation. The room reacted slowly, first a collective breath, then the faint creak of chairs as committee members adjusted their posture. Not out of discomfort, but alertness. The facade was thinning. We're a hybrid model, Barron offered quickly, fingers tapping lightly on the table, eyes darting between his folder and the screen in front of him. Public-private partnerships are a standard tool in modern reform. Crockett didn't argue. She agreed, but precisely. Yes, but standard partnerships come with standard disclosures, transparent contracts, competitive bidding, equitable access to data. What concerns me is not just the percentage, but the narrative. You've marketed this as private innovation rescuing public inefficiency, when in fact it's public funding underwriting a private profit model. Barron's response came too fast. We're not focused on profit, we're focused on results. And yet, Crockett said gently, results were not what you led with today. You led with branding, presence, software names, and digital engagement. Only when pressed did you offer figures, many of which, as we've established, don't hold under scrutiny. His shoulders tensed. The loose, confident posture from earlier had shrunk by degrees. He was no longer leaning into the mic. Now he sat slightly back, one arm on the table, the other resting across his chest, a defensive fold he probably didn't realize he'd adopted. He cleared his throat. We're still in early stages. Scaling is never clean. I understand that, Crockett replied, her voice softening, not in mercy, but in clarity. Which is why honesty matters. Because when taxpayers become investors, they deserve to know exactly what they're buying. A beat of silence followed, but it wasn't empty, it was heavy. The kind of silence that accumulates when truth has pushed past the spin and settled into the room. Undeniable. Barron Trump looked down briefly, no longer searching for words, but for footing. And there, beneath the marble and microphones, his confidence began to retreat. Jasmine Crockett didn't slam the table. She didn't raise her voice or lean across the aisle. Instead, she took a quiet breath, closed her leather portfolio for the first time since the hearing began, and let both hands rest flat on the surface before her. The act was small, unremarkable on its face, but the shift in energy was unmistakable. She was done building the case. Now she would reveal it. Mr. Chairman, she began, her voice steady but charged with something deeper, not volume, but conviction. With your permission, I'd like to offer a brief summary for the record. The chairman nodded cautiously. Proceed. Crockett turned back to Barron Trump, but this time, she wasn't cross-examining. She was illuminating. Mr. Trump, she said, you came here today to offer insight into public education reform. But what we've seen documented and under oath is a pattern that tells a different story. Not just about you, but about how we define expertise in this country. Her eyes scanned the room, not for effect, but for presence. She wanted everyone, not just the cameras, but the aides, the staffers, the tired reporters with coffee-stained notepads, to understand what had just unfolded. You were introduced with admiration for your innovation, your vision, your potential, she continued. But nowhere in that introduction did we hear about lived experience, professional qualifications, or long-term engagement with the communities most impacted by the policies you claim to improve. Barron didn't interrupt. He sat still, one hand now fidgeting with the corner of his tablet case. You presented software as a solution, Crockett went on, but when questioned, the results were unclear. The pricing, inflated. The outcomes, inconclusive. And the funding? Largely taxpayer money, despite the repeated suggestion that this was a private endeavor stepping in to fix what public systems have failed to do. Still no anger in her voice, just clarity. The kind of clarity honed through years of arguing for people no one else would listen to. And let's talk about assumptions, she said, voice rising just slightly, not louder, but fuller. You assumed you'd be taken seriously because of your name. You assumed educators would applaud because of your branding. You assumed a room like this would nod along, because they often do. A few glances exchanged quietly between committee members. Crockett noticed. She always noticed. But what you didn't anticipate, she said, folding her hands again, was being asked what you had actually seen, who you had actually served, what you had actually done, beyond the comfort of consultants and curated optics. And when those questions came, the answers fell apart. Not because you're malicious, but because you're untested. Barron lowered his gaze, not out of shame, but out of understanding, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about confronting a reality. And that, Crockett finished, voice unwavering, is what today was really about. Not personality, not party, but pattern. A pattern of dismissing experience, erasing data, and rewarding confidence over competence. And that pattern ends when truth is spoken plainly. She leaned back slightly. The silence that followed didn't just fill the room, it claimed it. There was a pause after Crockett's summation. Not the kind that invited interruption, but the kind that held a room hostage. The kind of silence that forces people to sit with what they've just heard. No one shifted. No one coughed. It was the kind of stillness that descends when something heavier than politics is placed on the table. And then Jasmine Crockett said the words, 10 of them, calmly, clearly, without venom or theatricality. Your privilege is not experience. Your confidence is not competence. There was no immediate outburst, no dramatic gasp, just stillness, and then something quieter, more powerful. In the second row of the gallery, a teacher in her 50s, dressed modestly in a cardigan and sensible shoes, blinked back tears and lowered her gaze, as if remembering all the times her expertise had been questioned by men with no classroom hours but plenty of opinions. A few seats away, a Latina school superintendent nodded slowly, her lips parting in a silent exhale of recognition. In the back, an older black woman with silver locks and a weathered notebook gave the faintest smile, the kind born not from victory, but from finally being seen. These weren't the faces of people cheering. These were the faces of people remembering. Across the room, even some of the men shifted uncomfortably, not because they disagreed, but because the words were too precise to ignore, too close to truth they had either witnessed or helped to perpetuate. Barron Trump, meanwhile, didn't speak, not at first. He stared at Crockett, his mouth slightly open, his brow furrowed, not in anger but in something far more unfamiliar. Revelation. The mask had slipped hours ago, but now, under the weight of 10 words and the thousands of stories they represented, it cracked fully. He blinked, swallowed, and when he did speak, his voice had lost its polish. It was quieter, stripped of performance. "I think," he began, then stopped. A long breath. "I think I underestimated the complexity of all this." No one clapped. No one needed to. The admission wasn't for applause. It was for acknowledgement, not just of error, but of inexperience, and the dangerous assumptions that often accompany it. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, as if accepting not an apology, but a beginning. And the room? The room finally exhaled, not in relief, but in respect. Because what had just unfolded wasn't just a takedown or a political win. It was a reckoning, delivered not through humiliation, but through the clarity of earned truth. 10 words, spoken without force, received with thunderous quiet, and nothing from that moment forward would be the same. By the time the hearing adjourned, the words had already taken flight, not through official transcripts or policy summaries, but through a 26-second clip ripped from a live stream and uploaded by a congressional intern who had sensed, instinctively, that something seismic had just occurred. The video was grainy, slightly off-center, but it captured the moment with unfiltered clarity. Jasmine Crockett, sitting straight-backed, eyes steady, voice unwavering. Your privilege is not experience. Your confidence is not competence. The line hit Twitter like lightning. Within 15 minutes, it was trending. Within an hour, it was viral. By sunset, it had crossed oceans. The phrase wasn't just repeated, it was felt, retweeted, printed on digital posters, paired with slow-motion replays of Crockett's calm delivery, set to music, stitched into TikTok montages, superimposed over courtroom sketches, a dozen different angles, but always the same effect. Recognition. Because it wasn't just a takedown, it was a mirror. Under hashtags like Crockett moment, she said it for me, and competence over confidence, women across the world began sharing stories, not of outrage but of repetition, familiarity, a quiet chorus of finally. A cardiac surgeon from Chicago posted, "I've performed over 3,000 operations. Still had a med student interrupt me during a consult to explain something I published a paper on. Today I felt seen." A former Air Force pilot wrote, 20 years flying. Still got told to calm down in a briefing last month when I questioned a tech spec. Crockett said what I've never been able to. A retired judge from Oregon added, "I've ruled on hundreds of cases, yet male attorneys still call me ma'am like I'm an assistant." That line? That line hit like justice, finally answering back. The stories kept coming, from boardrooms and ERs, from classrooms and courtrooms, from architects and auditors, engineers and editors, women over 50, women in their 30s, women just starting out. Thousands of testimonials from lives spent building mastery while watching others, often less qualified, always louder, get the microphone, the credit, the seat. But it wasn't just women. Men began sharing too. A tech executive posted, "I've hired brilliant women who were ignored until I repeated their ideas. Never again." That quote rewired something in me. And while news outlets scrambled to catch up, social media did what it does best: distilled the emotion, amplified the message, and carved Crockett's words into digital stone. By midnight, t-shirts were already being printed. By morning, editorial columns from the New York Times to Al Jazeera were quoting her. "A sentence that felt like a century of truth," one op-ed read, "not shouted, just delivered." And that's what made it impossible to look away. Back in her office, Jasmine Crockett sat quietly, reviewing policy drafts. She didn't check Twitter. She didn't bask in trending charts. She had seen enough virality to know it doesn't last unless it leads to something real. But outside those walls, something had cracked open. Not a spectacle, a reckoning. The headline had already made its rounds across every major network, every column inch of national papers, every opinion show from left to right. But what followed wasn't just noise. It was action. Because in the days that followed the hearing, something unusual happened on Capitol Hill. People from both sides of the aisle started listening. Jasmine Crockett's proposed legislation, long shelved in committee, quietly circulated but rarely championed, suddenly re-emerged with new urgency. The bill focused on increasing teacher salaries by 40% and expanding broadband infrastructure in underfunded school districts. Wasn't flashy. It didn't promise miracles. But it offered real solutions backed by real educators. And now, with a national spotlight on inequity and a name that symbolized clarity, it began gaining signatures. First from Democrats, then from a few moderate Republicans, and finally from a senator who had once publicly dismissed it as unsustainable. Policy analysts called it the Crockett effect. But to her, it wasn't about ego. It was about momentum. For once, the emotional weight of a moment was carrying substantive reform behind it. And it wasn't just Congress that felt the tremor. Barron Trump, to his credit, didn't vanish. He didn't retreat behind PR shields or reframe his narrative through spin doctors. Instead, in a rare press conference just days after the hearing, he stepped forward, flanked not by consultants, but by educators from districts his foundation claimed to serve. And standing beside them, professional, poised, and unmistakably composed, was Jasmine Crockett. "I've asked Representative Crockett," Barron said into the sea of microphones, "to co-chair our redesigned educational initiative. Because if this program is going to work for students and teachers, it has to be informed by people who have walked the hallways, not just written the checks." The room buzzed, not from scandal, from possibility. Crockett didn't smile when the cameras turned to her. She simply nodded, her voice calm. "This is a first step, not a photo op. If we want real equity, we have to build programs that serve, not showcase, that listen before launching." And across the country, the people listening weren't pundits. They were parents, teachers, school administrators, and everyday citizens who had spent years screaming into voids lined with bureaucracy. For once, they weren't being managed, they were being heard. At PTA meetings and town halls, people quoted her 10 words like scripture. In teachers' lounges, educators replayed clips, not just for validation, but as proof that someone inside the system finally knew what the inside looked like. They didn't just feel represented, they felt seen. In the weeks that followed the hearing, change didn't come like thunder. It came like a quiet reorganization of the ground beneath long-standing institutions. What Jasmine Crockett had done inside that room wasn't just corrective, it was instructive. And people who had long clung to titles, resumes, and inherited networks were suddenly being forced to answer a new kind of question. Do you know this problem from the inside? Philanthropic foundations, the very ones that had spent years funding glossy initiatives designed in executive boardrooms, began revisiting their vetting processes. Where once they prioritized proposals filled with data visualization, branding lingo, and scalability, they now wanted something far more radical: credibility rooted in lived reality. Several major education-focused funders released statements within a month of the hearing, announcing new requirements that every applicant must include a council of practicing educators, community members, and public school administrators from under-resourced districts in both the design and evaluation of their programs. For many, this shift was overdue. But for Jasmine Crockett, it was confirmation that dignity, when paired with discipline, could do more than disrupt. It could redefine. Educational nonprofits, some of which had operated for years without a single teacher on their advisory boards, began restructuring their leadership teams. Names started disappearing from websites quietly, replaced by new faces, principals, curriculum specialists, and community organizers who didn't speak in buzzwords, but who understood why a fifth-grade class in a building with no air conditioning isn't just a logistical issue, it's an ethical one. Crockett's questions had created a ripple, and suddenly organizations realized they could no longer afford to ignore the people closest to the problem. University departments of education began updating their curriculum to include the hearing transcript and coursework under a new module titled Lived Expertise and Public Accountability. One Ivy League professor called it a turning point in how we teach advocacy, less about posture, more about preparation. Think tanks and public policy schools started citing Crockett's approach as a case study in civic precision. How methodical truth, layered documentation, and composure could dismantle deeply embedded power structures without shouting. Not because shouting isn't valid, but because Crockett had demonstrated that you don't have to raise your voice when the facts are loud enough. She had done what few managed to do in public life, shift the standard without ever announcing she was trying to. Her power wasn't in the microphone. It was in the margin notes, the hours spent reading buried reports, the lived experience distilled into legal clarity. And more than anything, the refusal to match arrogance with outrage, instead choosing discipline over performance, insight over image. In a political landscape saturated with spectacle, she had offered something almost foreign, a new blueprint, one built not on charisma, but on character, not on declarations, but on receipts. And slowly the system began to adjust, not out of guilt, not even out of pressure, but because she had made integrity operational. The auditorium was packed, but Jasmine Crockett didn't stand behind the podium. She stepped to the front of the stage with just a handheld microphone, her heels softly clicking against the floor, the kind of presence that didn't need a spotlight to feel commanding. Before her sat nearly 300 law students, fresh faces full of ambition and uncertainty, many of them women, many of them students of color, all of them watching someone who had walked the path they were only beginning to imagine. She took a breath, smiled gently, and began. When I was in my second year of practicing law, I stood before a judge in a small Texas courtroom, mid-argument, citing precedent, quoting statute, composed, prepared. And somewhere between my opening and my second breath, the judge interrupted me to ask, "Sweetheart, is this your first big case?" A few gasps, a few incredulous chuckles, but Crockett didn't smile. I had already argued over 30 cases by that point, she continued, one more than I lost, and written briefs that had been cited across 3 counties. And yet, to him, all he saw was a young black woman with a calm voice and a confident posture, and assumed I must be new. I paused, nodded, and responded by referencing 3 rulings I'd won that year alone. That was the moment he stopped looking at me like a student and started hearing me like a lawyer. She let the moment sit, not for drama, for resonance. "I don't tell you this for applause," she said, walking slowly across the stage. "I tell you this because I know some of you in this room are going to walk into hearings, courtrooms, firms, and offices where they'll smile at you and call you honey before they ever read your resume. They'll interrupt you, correct you, diminish you, not because you're wrong, but because they're used to being the only ones in the room who sound like truth." She stopped at center stage and looked directly at the students. "Let them." The room hushed. "Let them underestimate you," she said, voice calm but resolute, "because that underestimation will become your advantage. While they posture, you'll prepare. While they assume, you'll study. While they talk, you'll build. And then one day, when it matters most, you will show up with calm in your chest, facts in your folder, and purpose in your bones, and they won't even see it coming." She smiled now, not for them, but for her younger self, still standing in that courtroom, still absorbing 1,000 small cuts that would one day become armor. Your story is your sword, she finished. Sharpen it with knowledge. Steady it with patience. And never, ever lower it just because someone else thinks you shouldn't be holding it. The applause was quiet at first. Then it grew, not wild, but wide, deep, because she hadn't just spoken to them. She had written a letter to every version of herself that had once been silenced. And finally, she had mailed it home. It was a Thursday afternoon, a few weeks after the hearing, and Jasmine Crockett had just finished visiting an elementary school in her district, one of the oldest buildings in the area, where the paint peeled near the stairwells and the heater clanked like a distant train. She had toured the library still using decade-old books and met with a class of fourth graders who proudly presented hand-drawn posters about clean water and safe streets. It had been a day filled with small smiles and quiet determination, the kind of place where hope didn't shout, it whispered. As she prepared to leave, an older woman approached her in the hallway. She wore a soft lavender cardigan and a name badge clipped to her chest. Ms. G. Lattimore, grade 2. Her hair was silver, curled tightly, and her hands were folded with the grace of someone who had carried both chalk and burdens for decades. Congresswoman Crockett, she said gently, her voice trembling just enough to be noticeable. I wanted to thank you, not just for visiting today, for what you said in the hearing. Crockett offered a kind smile. Thank you, Ms. Lattimore. I'm honored. But the woman didn't smile back right away. Her eyes welled up, the way tears sometimes rise before a person decides whether to let them fall. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of printer paper. It was a still image, printed from the internet, of Crockett seated at the hearing, mid-sentence, her hands clasped, her eyes unwavering. My daughter and I watched it together, she said, voice now barely above a whisper. She's an engineer, been one for nearly 20 years, and for most of those years, she's had her ideas ignored until a younger man repeated them in the same room. Crockett's face softened. She didn't speak. She just listened. When you said, your privilege is not experience, your confidence is not competence, my daughter just cried. Ms. Lattimore wiped at her cheek quickly, almost embarrassed. She didn't even realize how much she had held in until she heard someone say it out loud. You weren't just talking to him. You were speaking for her, and for me, and for every woman I've taught beside who's been asked to justify what she already knows. Jasmine stepped closer and gently placed her hand over the woman's. You all have been speaking for years, she said softly. I just gave it a microphone. The two women stood there in the hallway, surrounded by faded posters, quiet classrooms, and generations of silent resistance. No reporters, no cameras, just two voices, one that had been quieted too long and one that had learned to speak for both. It wasn't a viral moment. It was something deeper. It was the reason Jasmine Crockett had spoken those words in the first place. There was no standing ovation when Jasmine Crockett left that school hallway. No breaking news banners or press releases waiting to spin the moment. Just a quiet walk back to her car, the late afternoon sun slanting low across the hood, and the hum of children's voices echoing faintly behind her. It was fitting, she thought, that the real moments, the ones that mattered most, rarely came with fanfare. Later that week, she was invited to speak at a national leadership summit in D.C. The theme was legacy. She stepped onto the stage in a room filled with CEOs, policymakers, foundation directors, and future candidates. But when she opened her speech, she didn't talk about power. She talked about preparation. I've been asked a lot about what it means to lead, she began, voice steady, tone more personal than political. And I'll tell you this, it doesn't begin with a title. It doesn't come with wealth, and it certainly doesn't arrive on the shoulders of a name. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. True leadership, she continued, is earned. It's built in the quiet hours, the late nights spent reading what no one else bothers to read, the discipline to listen before speaking, the patience to endure being ignored without letting it make you smaller, and the principle to tell the truth, not when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. Heads in the audience nodded, not because they'd never heard these ideas before, but because they were hearing them now from someone who had lived them. She spoke about being underestimated, about courtrooms where she was called honey, about policies written without the people they affected, about how change didn't come through declarations, but through documentation, through showing up prepared again and again until the system had no choice but to respond. She didn't need to invoke names. The country knew the moment she was referencing. It had replayed it over and over. The calm, the cross-examination, the quote that cracked a facade heard round the world. But what mattered more than that viral moment was what followed. Legislation gaining ground, communities feeling seen, and institutions beginning to change. Not because someone shouted, but because someone showed up ready. Real power, she said, isn't in dominating a room. It's in holding your space with purpose. It's in being grounded when others perform. It's in knowing the material so well that no assumption can distort it. And then, as she prepared to close, her voice softened, not weaker, just more intimate.